right? So in counterpoint to this conventional genealogy, I analyze contemporary logistics as a transformation, perhaps a neoliberalization of routines of settler colonialism and settler capitalism in the US and beyond. The term that I'm going to talk about for the rest of this talk, settler capitalist logisticality, is meant to identify settler colonialism as a mode of transit for contemporary logistical capitalism. Following Chickasaw scholar Jodi Bird's use of the term transit, I suggest that repertoires of settler colonialism operationalize, are originary to exemplify, and provide a medium for the movement and expansion of assemblages of logistical capitalism. Indeed, those of you who have read Bird's Transit of Empire know that its theorizations of movements of imperial planetarity that invoke Indianness for the operational ends of invasion heavily figures what I'm naming settler logisticality. My foregrounding of coloniality, the coloniality of logistics, aligns with a new thinking or a rethinking of capitalism as an irreducibly colonial formation with global inceptions. It emerges not through the nation state, but in and through hierarchical, uneven, and discontinuous colonial networks. The colonial character continues through states as colonial empires and settler states, then in and through our current neoliberal disaggregations of governance. So for me, the paradigmatic space of logistics is not the supply chain of contemporary capitalism, but the colonial supply line. As Cowan notes, quote, "It is not only striking but diagnostic that old enemies of empire, Indians and pirates, are among the groups that pose the biggest threats to the security of supply today. It is also incredibly revealing that these groups frame their struggle in explicitly anti-imperial terms. The resurfacing of the supply line at the center of contemporary geopolitical economy with the echoes of empire connects present war with past forms and indicts the era of national territory as the historical anomaly." I also want to say I'm indebted to David Lloyd and Patrick Wolf's 2015 essay. It's great, please read it, Settler Colonial Logics and the Neoliberal Regime. Here, citing how Israel's occupation of Palestine recapitulates earlier strategies of settler colonial domination in North America and Australasia, Lloyd and Wolf assert, quote, "the necessity of grasping the importance of theorizing the formation and evolution of settler regimes in order to comprehend ongoing developments." They see settler regimes as still being relevant most fundamentally in the managing of surplus populations. And so quoting them again, "It is in relation to the community of redundancy, we believe, that settler colonialism's inventory of local strategies is becoming increasingly congenial to neoliberalism's emergent order." So I think this is true, but I also think that their essay's strengths limit its insights. Their analysis of the present of Palestine through the past of European settler state expansion structures a historical narrative around the fact of the closure of the frontier. So in order to explain Israeli resistance to applying eliminatory strategies of assimilation to Palestinians, they posit that Israeli colonialism has not yet achieved a post-frontier moment, when presumably strategies of assimilatory elimination will replace war, removal, confinement, etc. From the point of view of logistics, however, the whole world is frontier, and it is never closed, but open for perpetual flexible settlement and unsettlement as it suits the purposes of targeted extractions, flows, and circulations. So while managing surplus populations is part of it, I argue that routines associated with settler state territorial expansion are also being remade with critical modifications, right? So settler logisticality today does not need large-scale physical settlement, right? It might just be logistical capital that's settling. And its processes of eliminating to replace are more targeted and much more temporally uncertain than state building. But rather than being in a post-frontier period, with Palestine being the exception, we might say that Palestine is integrated into a colonial state-building project, which indeed intends to annex all of the occupied Palestinian territories as soon as it can remove most Palestinians, and it's also integrated into localized global routines of perpetual settlement. And I'm thinking here of the industrial and agricultural zones that have annexed so much of the land of so much of Area C in the West Bank. In perpetual flexible settlement, mobility remains key, and the figure Lloyd and Wolf identify as the mobile pioneer, which may now be logistical command and control, remains linked to its other, quote, the immobile, exterminated, dispossessed indigenous who, as Bird reminds us, representationally subtends the terrorist, and in particular now, the critical infrastructure terrorist. Have any of you heard those words before, critical infrastructure terrorist? It's a thing, okay. Watch out for it. I want to consider how settler capitalist logisticality transits strategies from what scholars call the period of the lethal interlude. So how extractive and logistical capitalism today are transmitting strategies from what we often think of as the period of the fatal interlude when we think about settler colonialism. And the fatal interlude is the time between theoretical conquest and actual conquest, between claims of discovery and ownership and the always incomplete establishment of settler state sovereignty. The lethal interlude is associated with kinds of colonial domination that operate through partial and segmented land appropriation, secured through ruthless violence and maintained through forced benevolent pacification of the surviving population. The strategies of the period of the lethal interlude work precisely because they are drawn out, because they establish control gradually, exploiting states of the external becoming internal, and of quasi-legality, such as squatters' rights and homesteading, which allow for a tactical versatility in claim-making. In the lethal interlude, lines between military, police, and private security entangle, blurring legal and extra-legal violence to attain on the ground an authoritative ordering of space. So how might we think the operations of logistical capitalism as tending towards a kind of permanent lethal interlude? Its geographical coordinates might follow the pipelines of flow, which, to return to Cowan, are, quote, not only displacing the borders of national territory, but are also recasting geographies of law and violence that were organized by the inside-outside of state space. The quasi-legality of transnational logistics space relies on making claims through new or unsanctioned processes that are often the undoing of laws. Happy to talk about that in terms of Foxconn, anytime. And logistical capitalism blurs military policing and private security up and down the pipeline of circulation and supply, expanding everywhere point-based security, outposts, checkpoints, fusion centers. Crucially, settler logisticality's lethal interlude, like settler colonialism itself, is a failed project. As Nicholas Brown writes, indigenous theory calls attention to a fundamental paradox whereby violence has not ended, yet invasion has not succeeded, signaling both the failure of settler colonialism as it highlights the continuous character of dispossession.